By the spring of 1860, the Delaney place wore its tiredness like old paint, flaking, thin, unable to hide the wood rot beneath. 200 acres of delta soil could be generous when the river behaved, and the sky kept faith. But generosity had abandoned Clement Delaney. A blight had halved his harvest 2 years running. The banks in New Orleans had not. Notes compounded like thorns. Debts flowered in ledgers. And Clement, medium of height, brown hair silvering at the edges, hands roughened from work he was never meant to do alone, began to shrink into a man of figures and schemes. New Orleans pulsed just downriver with its markets, auctions, and the easy language of buying and selling people. At Delaney Plantation, that language had once been spoken softly, as if volume could sanctify a sin. Now it crept into dinner conversation and drifted up stairwells like smoke. Joanna, 38 and worn to the thread, watched her husband's eyes harden into little brass coins. The girls, Arlene at 19, Caroline at 17, Frida just 15, felt his gaze as measure, not affection. It weighed their health, their movements, their futures. It did not bless. The field hands had been born on the land, most of them, their lives a long braid of seasons and sorrow. Tobias, broad-shouldered, steady, about 30, kept order because Clement lacked the money for an overseer and the presence for fear. Lia, 25, worked the big house with quiet competence, wary eyes, and a spine that remembered freedom as a rumor. The quarters hummed with the 1,000 small resistances of the enslaved. Stolen moments, traded recipes, lullabies sung low. Lately, even those hush songs thinned. Clement's temper made a windless heat. Something shifted in him that winter. The doctor, Reuben McCormick, local, pragmatic, came for a social call and found law books stacked on Clement's desk, their spines cracked along chapters on property and inheritance. "Light reading?" the doctor asked, forcing a smile. Clement returned a shrug that felt like a door closing. Later, McCormick would recall questions that clung to him like burrs, about fertility, about childbirth, about the legal status of a child born to an enslaved mother. The doctor answered carefully and left quickly, troubled by the new arithmetic working behind Clement's eyes. Clement traveled twice that season to New Orleans. He returned with a leather case, papers wrapped in oilcloth, and a name he didn't quite pronounce. Bogard, a man who lived upstairs from a tavern where cards snapped and lies poured easy. Bogard had a skill useful to desperate men. He could make paper say what a conscience could not. By March, the plantation's rhythms soured. Doors in the big house acquired new locks. The girls' letters, already infrequent in a region where politics tightened every conversation, were suddenly discouraged, then forbidden. Visits were canceled for safety, as if the outside world had grown ravenous while the inside remained a sanctuary. At table, Clement ate quickly, eyes lowered to his plate or drifted to his daughter's with a clinician's scrutiny. He scribbled notes between bites, appetite, complexion, pallor, as if dinner were a ledger and they, entries to balance. In the quarters, separations appeared that had nothing to do with work. Men and women who had shared laughter over washtubs or prayed shoulder to shoulder after dusk found themselves split by new rules. Clement spoke of efficiency and modern methods, the way a drowning man speaks of driftwood. Tobias read the truth in Lia's clenched hands. He saw Clement looking at people not as lives but as outputs, inputs, variables in a plan sharpened by hunger and shame. Joanna felt the thing in the walls first. She would wake in the small hours and sit at the edge of the bed, listening to the boards breathe. A house tells on its inhabitants if you let it. Here, drawers closed quickly when she entered. A key whispered in a lock down the corridor. Clement spent long nights in his office, a candle guttering over columns of figures, and a Bible opened not for comfort, but for precedent. When she reached for his arm, he flinched, not from her touch, but from interruption. The man who had once bent his back in the rows to spare his pride. "We're farmers, Joanna." "Same as any," he'd say, now bent his mind toward something he would not name. In April, Dr. McCormick returned on legitimate business. He found Caroline trembling without fever, Frida thinner than weeks before, Arlene distant as if from exile. "Nerves," Clement said, smiling without warmth. "The times." McCormick examined the girls with a caution he could not justify to himself and prescribed rest. He left more unsettled than he arrived. He would later say it felt like entering a room recently evacuated. Chairs warm, glasses damp. The air still disturbed by a conversation he had not heard. Sheriff Mullins visited in May, on the trail of runaways rumored in the parish. He noted new bolts inside certain doors and kept his observation to himself. Men like Mullins had categories for trouble. Domestic strangeness slipped from his grasp. Besides, Clement had known him years. A man's debts, his silences, his declining harvest, these could be pitied. The sheriff chalked the stiffness he sensed to embarrassment and rode away. Then came summer, where the humidity turns resolve into something pliable. Clement had found a phrase, Latin old Partus Sequitur Ventrem. The child follows the condition of the mother. He rolled it in his mouth like a coin. The law, designed to fix bondage to birth, had for him another promise. If paper could say a child belonged to a womb that did not bear it, then paper could convert a life into balance due, with the right witness, with the right seal, with a man like Bogart upstairs from a tavern. $50 per falsified breath. Clement gathered herbs from a woman by the bayou, a healer named Marie who had seen men like him, and still believed more in cures than in causes. He spoke of women's regularity, of strengthening tonics, and she, who had mended so many with so little, sold him what he asked. He administered them to his daughters as tonics, holding the cups, watching them swallow. Fatherly concern waxed into ritual. He tracked their days on paper. He tightened the schedule of the house until each hour could be found and accounted for. Arlene noticed first, and put words to it. "He's measuring us," she whispered to her mother on the back stair. Joanna felt her heart crack along an old fissure, and told her daughter to pray, because prayer was what she had when action seemed madness. But prayer answers slowly. Paper moves fast. Clement's sums told him that time eaten by hesitation was money he did not have. In October, the air cooled enough to feel like reprieve. Clement used the change like a stage cue. He asked Arlene to come to his office. She sat across from him as if facing a magistrate. He did not thunder. He did not strike, he explained. He spoke of survival, of sacrifices families made in hard times, of the Lord's mysterious allotments. He spoke as if proposing an arrangement among equals, the language so calm that for a moment she doubted her own understanding. Then she understood. She said no. He locked her door. For 3 days the house became a chamber of echoes, a key turning, bargaining voices, the scrape of a tray set on the floorboards. Clement read aloud the figures of the family debt through the wood, as if numbers could convince where love could not. When he grew tired of persuasion, he threatened. When threats exhausted themselves, he returned to persuasion. On the 4th day the house fell still. Down in the quarters, word moved without sound. Tobias stood in the doorway of his cabin and watched the big house as men watch a sky they know will break. Laia kept to her work, hands steady, eyes breaking only when she was sure they would not be seen. Among the enslaved, dread was not a new feeling. It was a weather pattern, but this was different. A storm riding the ridge of the family itself, crossing that last human boundary between blood and hunger. Clement told himself that leadership was the art of bearing what others could not. He told himself that the law had made distinctions for a reason, and that he, being a practical man, would make use of them. He told himself that he was protecting his wife and daughters from ruin, from public auction, from disgrace worse than any private arrangement. He had learned to stack rationalizations like cordwood. They burned hot and clean. They threw little smoke. He met with Bogart once more by lantern light, money exchanged in the narrow room above the tavern where sailors laughed beneath their feet. "You'll have what you need," Bogart said, and produced paper thick enough to make a lie feel sturdy. Seals, lines for names. A template for erasing one mother and writing another in her place. On a cool night in November, the river carried a sweet rot, and the first geese sketched their black chevrons across a moon bleached thin. Clement walked the yard with a ring of keys. Behind him trailed the arithmetic of his crimes, not yet committed, counting themselves forward. Upstairs, Joanna knelt on the braided rug beside her bed and made a bargain with God she knew would not hold. In the quarters, Tobias lay awake and measured his breath against the creak of the house timbers, promising himself that when the time came to protect, he would not fail. The Delaney place had entered a new season, and none within its boundary could claim ignorance. The lines were drawn, though no hand had yet crossed them. The first steps of the plan were set. A father's conscience had been traded for paper and price. A mother's fear had ripened into something that would soon be action. Daughters stood at the brink of a machinery they could not stop, and men and women in bondage braced themselves to be used as tools within it. History often marks such moments with dates and declarations, the passage of a law, the boom of a cannon. Here it was quieter, the small sound of a key turning, the soft tear of a seal pressed to paper, the whisper of a prayer that was also a vow. Delaney Plantation slept that night under a sky clean as bone. By morning, nothing visible had changed, but the house knew. The land knew, and the people, each of them, felt the floor tilt a fraction toward darkness. Morning came thin and gray, the kind that makes even a good house look undecided. Delaney Plantation woke to the sounds it always knew. Bucket to well, kettle to hook. Gate latch tapping in the breeze, but beneath the ordinary moved a new rhythm, counted in keys and cautions. Clement appeared at breakfast with a small, leather-bound book in his breast pocket. It rode there like a second heart. He did not touch his food. Instead, he unfolded a sheet with neatly ruled columns and announced adjustments as if posting weather. Curfew at 9. No visitors without my say. The girls' lessons to be done in the study where I can see. Work rosters in the quarters will be posted Saturdays, and I will revise them as needed. New locks are for safety. Doors will be checked each evening. He glanced at each face and found nothing he did not expect. Joanna's silence, Arlene's bright, contained refusal, Caroline's trembling hands. Frida's chin defiantly lifted above fear. He folded the sheet, tapped his breast pocket to be sure the small book still lived, and stood. "We have a harvest to bring in," he said. "Let's behave like it." The new rules arrived fast as a shower. Keys multiplied. Keys to the front door, to the back hall, to the rooms at the top of the stairs. Keys on a ring that never left his hand. By dusk, the house had a different sound, metal against metal. A small command answered by a small surrender. In the quarters, change showed itself as separation. The long bench where men and women had shelled peas in the shade now sat empty by day and chained to the wall by night. Sleeping spaces were reassigned. 2 cabins near the sycamores were fitted with bolts on the outside. Clement called them special rooms, a phrase that sorened the mouth even as he said it. He told Tobias to see that they stayed swept, stocked with water and clean cloth. Tobias nodded because the right nod at the right time could buy another day to think. The ledger emerged the second night. Clement placed it on his desk, opened a bottle of ink, and gave himself a title he did not speak aloud. On the first page he wrote the date. Beneath it, columns labeled in a clerk's hand. Name, health, cycle, pairing, result, notes. The neatness of the script felt like an apology the paper did not deserve. He began with inventories. He watched meals, recorded appetites. He sent Arlene and Caroline to walk the veranda each evening and timed their laps under the pretense of fresh air, writing afterward, complexion good, fatigue moderate. He had Leia boil the tonic twice daily. When Joanna asked what herbs it contained, he said, "Bitter things that do good." She tasted the mug he brought, swallowed, and felt their bitterness lodge like a stone under her tongue. Joanna learned the ledger's existence before she saw it. She noticed the way Clement's eyes slid to his pocket when the girls entered a room. She noticed the poised pen when they coughed. Once passing his office, she heard pages turn, soft as moths, and knew the sound instantly. Accounts, not scripture. That night she sat at the end of the bed and folded her hands in her lap, the habit of prayer without its words, and tried to name what courage would require of her. The household moved under supervision. The piano stood silent. Needlework baskets gathered a little dust. Letters were composed then, reviewed by Clement, and returned with red slashes through any mention of time, health, visitors. When Caroline protested, "They're only to Miss Porter," he nodded toward the ledger, not unkindly, as if showing her a school book. "We must be careful how we tell our story," he said. The phrase would later loop through Joanna's mind like a curse, "how we tell our story." Tobias listened more than he spoke. He made his rounds in the fields, keeping the rows straight and tempers cooler than the air allowed. and built a quiet map inside himself. He counted keys on Clement's ring. He timed the man's steps from yard to office and back. He studied the hinge on the new locks and touched each bolt with a thumb, learning its grit. With Laya, he exchanged the kind of looks that do not need a language, and when they spoke at the pump, it was of nothing. The price of salt. The coming rain, while their silences said, "Wait, watch. Not yet." News travels without sound among those whom danger keeps in close company. Everyone felt a threshold had been crossed, though the worst of it had not yet occurred. The men avoided Clement's gaze. The women held their little ones a fraction tighter. At dusk, the quarters sang low, a hum in which grief and comfort braid themselves until neither is a stranger to the other. Inside the house, Clement rehearsed his explanations. He practiced the words in the glass after shaving. He tried tones, managerial, pious, fatherly. He found that quiet worked best. Quiet made even terrible things sound reasonable. When he summoned Arlene again, he did it in daylight. He left the office door open so the sun could enter, as if light could launder a demand. He spoke of duty, of debt, of how a family survives what would break ordinary people. He said her no would cost all of them their home. He did not say that he had already built rails along which this train would run. Arlene stood straight and placed her hands at her sides so they wouldn't shake. She did not plead. "It is wrong," she said. "It is against God." Clement's mouth thinned. "God placed me head of this household," he answered, "and he will judge me for how I keep it." They looked at each other for a long moment, both certain and beyond persuasion. That night the ledger took its first ink in the column he had labeled pairing. He wrote names he pretended were merely letters on a page, not people he had made. He added a time. He closed the book and laid the pen across its spine like a bar. Before anything could happen, Clement needed to press other lives into the machine. He called Tobias to the veranda after sundown. The lantern between them threw the kind of light that lies, making the good look ghostly and the cruel look kind. "I require your help," Clement said. Tobias did not answer, not because he did not hear, but because there are words that leave no honest reply. "You will ensure my instructions are followed." "There will be no force," he lied quickly, sensing the flare in Tobias's eyes. "Only guidance. We will be discreet. I will not have scandal." He offered money he did not have and threats he did. He described the families he would sell whole if he were disobeyed. He named children Tobias had taught to walk. "He named Laya, you understand me?" he asked. Tobias replied in the grammar survival permits. "Yes, sir." The yes was a bridge. The sir was a debt coming due. When he found Laya later by the wash line, the moon a thin coin above the trees, he did not touch her arm because their lives could not afford witnesses. "He'll try soon," he said, voice low. He keeps his book in the bottom right drawer. Keys on the ring with the brass tag. He drinks after sundown, walks the yard when he's troubled. That's most nights now. Laya nodded once. "I'll be where I can hear," she said. Between them moved something that was not planned yet, but would be. Joanna, meanwhile, decided she could not wait for Providence to grow legs. She began her own record on scraps she hid inside the hem of a shawl. Times of footsteps in the hall, the smell of ink at midnight, the names Clement had let slip when he thought himself persuasive. She could not stop the thing yet, but she could witness it accurately. Some acts of resistance start as a refusal to forget. The special rooms took their final shape by week's end. A pallet, a pitcher, a folded cloth, a Bible on a rough shelf like a juror staring down an accused. Clement stood in the doorway and nodded, as if approving a storeroom. He gave Tobias instructions about the bolt and told him when to come and when to leave. He did not look long at the bed. The first attempt came on a night too still for comfort. The river lay without wrinkle. Crickets paused as if listening. Clouds had moved on, leaving the moon too honest. Clement paced a small rectangle in the yard, counting his footsteps, whispering the lines he had practiced until they lost meaning. Upstairs, Joanna opened her window to the heat and knelt without candles so the darkness would not have to watch. Arlene sat on the edge of her bed and held her breath in fours until the room steadied. When Clement lifted the key, his hand shook and he hated the shake because it felt like doubt, and doubt is a poor tool. He steadied himself, set his mouth, and turned the lock. The metal made a sound like a small decision finalized. What followed did not play out like the clean lines in his ledger. People are not lines. They resist even when they still their bodies. Tobias refused to be the tool Clement needed him to be and stood outside the door instead, his broad back a wordless no that might yet cost him everything. Laia walked the length of the back hall twice, then 3 times, listening for the sound her life could not allow to pass unanswered. Joanna moved down the corridor like a shadow and placed herself on the far side of a wall, her palm against plaster, as if her touch could brace it. Clement returned to his desk later with a face that had learned to be blank. He sat open the ledger and wrote. The ink made its tidy scratches. He closed the book, placed the key on top of it, and stared until the flame in his lamp guttered. The next day, he doubled the rules. Locks were checked twice instead of once. The tonic was served warmer, more bitter, as if heat could make obedience. He told himself the hitch in the machinery would ease with repetition. Systems need practice. People break, but the house had started learning the language of interruption. Tobias began appearing exactly where Clement did not expect him. Laia learned which floorboards annoyed the most and stepped on them at crucial moments so that attention shifted and minutes passed and chances thinned. Joanna practiced calm like an instrument, filled rooms at just the wrong times for secrets, and learned to ask questions that forced Clement to rearrange his hours. A mother's interference can look like fussing. It can also be strategy. Caroline watched all of this from the doorway of her own fear. She had always been the delicate one, but delicacy has ways of seeing. She began to keep a glass of water by her bed and drop a spoon in it when footsteps paused outside her door. An invented symptom, a complaint the doctor had once told her could come with a little lightheadedness. The spoon's chime rang politely but insistently, an alarm no man could accuse of accusation. Frida, youngest and most alive to what is plainly wrong, tried to bargain with God by making bargains with herself. If I do not cry today, he will stop this. If I learn all my verses by heart, he will move Papa back into the person he used to be. She woke each morning with resolve and found by noon that children's magic cannot outmuscle a man's will. Clement noticed the friction and mistook it for teething. He believed his plan was a child learning to chew. Awkward now, efficient soon. He told himself that structures are mercy, that once everyone accepted the schedule, there would be less suffering. In this way, he managed to call cruelty order and sleep at least a little. By Advent, the season that promises a light not yet visible, the household moved inside a choreography none would have chosen. The first pairing was recorded. The first lie on paper traveled through a tavern's upstairs door to a desk in the big house. A mother measured hours by the sound of keys. A father measured progress by the number of pages filled. In the quarters, men and women held their tongues to keep them from saying the kind of words that change lives too early. Winter laid itself over the delta like a sheet. Breath smoked in the morning. The river wore a thin metal sheen where it slowed. If you passed Delaney Plantation on the road north, you would have seen nothing remarkable. A house in need of paint, fields waiting their turn, smoke steady from the kitchen chimney. Inside, a ledger fattened and a lock learned how easily it obeyed. The first consequence would arrive with the new year, carried in a body that had no say. But for now, the end of 1860, a calendar surrendered to a scheme. Everyone inside the boundary felt fate harden into schedule, and somewhere beyond the reach of keys, a different book, the kind that cannot be forged, began to keep its own account. The first winter of the new decade settled over the Mississippi Delta like a heavy quilt, muffling the cries and sharpening the silences. Frost glazed the edge of the cotton rows. The river thickened with slow ice, and inside the 2-story house, the Delaneys lived within the narrow world Clement had built from ink, law, and fear. The House of Waiting by January 1861. The girls no longer spoke of escape. Doors that once opened to sunlight now held locks polished by daily touch. The windows of the upper floor remained sealed. Clement said the drafts would sicken them. Joanna, obeying in outward gestures, folded her rebellion small and kept it under her tongue. Clement's ledger had grown dense. He wrote at dawn and again before sleep, the nib scratching like an insect behind the walls. The pages filled with entries no stranger would question. Supplies ordered, harvest tallies, accounts paid. But each notation had a hidden twin written in a smaller hand along the margins. There he recorded cycles, dates, and the initials of those he meant to use. He studied his book as a priest studies scripture, whispering figures, calculating months. The law he had found, Partus Sequitur Ventrem, turned endlessly in his mind, a perfect machine of cruelty that asked no mercy and promised profit. The first birth, when the thaw came in March, the first consequence arrived with it. Arlene, pale as the bedsheets, began to labor before dawn. Joanna sent Lia to fetch Clement. He appeared calm, sleeves rolled, hands already washed. He dismissed the slaves from the room and locked the door. The hours dragged into nightmare. There was no midwife, no doctor, only Clement with his borrowed manuals and his monstrous conviction that secrecy mattered more than pain. Arlene screamed until her voice broke. Joanna begged to help and was struck across the face for her interference. When the child's cry finally rose, thin and bewildered, Clement did not smile. He only examined the infant's skin tone in the lamplight, judging color the way he once judged cotton. "Healthy," he said flatly. "Good." Within the hour, the baby was gone, taken to the quarters and placed in the arms of a woman who had just buried her own. Arlene's arms were empty, her eyes unfocused. She asked once where her son was, and Clement told her, "He is where he must be." Then he closed the door. 2 days later, Bogard's forged certificate arrived from New Orleans. The paper smelled faintly of rum and ink. The name of the mother read Lia, the mark of legitimacy stamped by a church that had never seen the child. Clement tucked the document between the ledger's pages, satisfied. A week later, a trader from the city paid him $250 for a fine mixed infant, 6 pounds, healthy lungs. Clement called it salvation. Joanna called it damnation under her breath. The price of silence, doctor. McCormick was summoned that spring, ostensibly to check on a family ailment. He found Arlene trembling, her skin clammy, pulse faint. Clement met him in the hall with a pouch of coins. "There will be questions if you speak of this," he said softly. "And the war makes men nervous about scandal." McCormick looked at the girl's hollow eyes and then at the money. He nodded once, cowardice disguised as professional discretion. On his way home, he vomited into the ditch and told himself he could not afford virtue this year. Sheriff Mullen stopped by soon after, investigating whispers of missing slaves in neighboring parishes. Clement poured him whiskey, spoke of politics and loyalty to the South, and lamented the troubles that came when people forgot their place. Mullen saw nothing but a tired landowner and a house too quiet for comfort. He left with his suspicions dulled by brandy. Paper mothers. Through the humid months, Clement perfected his system. Bogard's papers arrived regularly now. Baptismal records, birth certificates, property receipts, all forged with a neatness that made sin look bureaucratic. Each child born under the roof of Delaney Plantation gained a false mother on paper and lost a real one in flesh. Joanna began to piece the pattern together. She noticed that the dates on Clement's correspondence matched the swelling of her daughters' bellies. She watched the wagons leaving before dawn, carrying bundles too small for trade goods. Her prayers turned from pleas to curses whispered into her pillow. Caroline's turn came next. The summer heat pressed through the shutters as her labor began, slower and crueler than Arlene's. Joanna tried to hold her hand, but Clement forbade it. When the bleeding wouldn't stop, he sent Tobias running for Dr. McCormick. The doctor arrived too late to prevent the damage. He could only keep her alive. When Clement showed him the newborn, a pale boy with gray eyes, McCormick understood at last what the papers meant. "You can't," he started, then saw the ledger open on the desk, a pistol beside it. He closed his mouth. The second baby left the plantation within days, sold for $275 to a merchant bound for Charleston. Clement noted the transaction in tidy ink, then turned the page. Joanna's witness, night after night, Joanna sat awake, the candle guttering low, writing scraps of truth on any paper she could hide. Dates, names, the number of wagons, the initials on the forgeries. She slipped each piece into the lining of an old Bible, the one Clement never touched anymore. She prayed not for forgiveness, but for remembrance. Lia, forced to assist at each birth, began to change too. Her hands shook when she brought meals to the big house. She spoke little, but her eyes had hardened into something metallic. Tobias noticed and waited for her in the field path one evening. "How many now?" he asked quietly. "2 white, 1 brown," she answered. "And more to come." He looked toward the house. "Then we'll have to count something else soon," he said. The third birth by early autumn, Frida, barely 17, was heavy with child. She had resisted the longest, fought the hardest, and broken last. Her labor came on a night of thunder. The baby was small, premature, silent until Laia slapped its back. When it cried, Frida wept from both relief and despair. Clement took the infant from her arms before dawn. "You'll thank me one day," he murmured. Frida screamed until her voice was raw, then fell into a silence that frightened everyone. The next week, Clement traveled again to New Orleans. When he returned, the briefcase was lighter, his face calm. Frida's baby had fetched $225. He bought new ledgers and spoke cheerfully of a future expansion once the war passed. The seeds of revolt in the quarters, the enslaved whispered of ghosts walking the halls, of babies who cried in dreams. Tobias knew better. They were still alive somewhere, renamed and resold, proof of crimes too vast for prayer. He began to gather trust among the men, small things first, tools left unaccounted for, signals tapped on the wallboards. Laia became his messenger. Joanna, without realizing it at first, became his ally. Each of them had lost something that could not be returned. And each began to understand that the only mercy left was ending Clement's dominion. The winter of 1861 drew near. The Union fractured. Newspapers shouted war. But inside Delaney Plantation, another conflict had already begun. Quiet, personal, and waiting for its moment. The next child would not only mark another sale, it would mark the beginning of the reckoning. Winter came heavy over Louisiana that year. Gray skies, bare orchards, and the slow, damp chill that made even strong men move quieter. The war had begun far to the north, but its echoes reached the Delta in rumors and in shortages. Prices rose. Men were conscripted. Wagons rolled south carrying sons who would never return. Yet inside the boundaries of Delaney Plantation, a different war, private and wordless, was already at its bloodiest stage. The second cycle by, January 1862, Clement had turned his plantation into a machine. He called it routine, but everyone else felt the word ritual. The ledger swelled with new columns, lines so neatly ruled they hid the filth of what they recorded. At the top of one page he had written in small, deliberate script, projected yield 1862-1863. Below it, 5 names: Arlene, Caroline, Frida, Laia, and Ruth, a young field girl barely 16, each followed by spaces for date of conception, birth, and market value. He wrote these as calmly as any cotton tally, adjusting margins as if the human body were an asset to be refined. Arlene was the first to conceive again. Clement congratulated himself on proving consistency. He even wrote to Bogart in New Orleans, "Expect another document within the quarter." The operation runs smooth. Caroline followed in March, though her health had never recovered from her first pregnancy. Her skin had turned waxen, her hands trembled even at rest. Joanna begged her husband to let the girl heal. Clement's reply was cold. "The field doesn't rest because it's tired." Frida, barely 18 now, still limped from the injuries of her previous childbirth. But Clement's ambition did not recognize frailty. He ordered Tobias to ensure compliance. Tobias obeyed outwardly, because refusal would doom everyone, but he moved like a man dragging his own chains. When Clement was gone, he whispered to Frida, "Endure a little longer. We will not let him win forever." The House of Shadows, Joanna's home, became a tomb with living occupants. Curtains stayed drawn. The piano gathered dust and silence. Meals were taken without speech. The daughters moved through the house like ghosts rehearsing grief. Laia, forced to assist in every birth, grew thinner by the week. The other women in the quarters had begun to call her the keeper of sorrow. They watched her carry linen stained with blood and return empty-handed. Some crossed themselves when she passed. Clement, meanwhile, no longer saw women or slaves or even daughters, only variables. His notes grew precise and colder. Arlene, 5th month, fair health. Frida, slight resistance, will monitor. Tobias showing signs of insolence, observe. He had long since stopped using names in his mind. He thought of people by category, bearers, assistants, guards. Humanity had become an inconvenience to arithmetic. Arlene's breaking point by midsummer. Arlene's belly swelled again. She rarely spoke. Sometimes she would sit by the window and whisper to the wind. Her voice so faint it sounded like a prayer to no one in particular. Joanna watched her daughter fade and knew that something inside the girl had already died. The second labor began in September 1862. It was storm season, lightning cracking over the river, rain turning the paths into ribbons of mud. Clement forbade anyone from leaving the house. The birth was long and brutal. Arlene bled for hours, her body refusing the cruelty forced upon it. When the baby finally arrived, it made no sound. Laia wrapped the stillborn child and handed it to Clement without a word. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the tiny face, then said flatly, "A loss." He wrote it in his ledger as if recording a spoiled shipment. He did not see Arlene's vacant stare or Joanna's shaking hands. The number had been added. The page was balanced. That night, Arlene tried to hang herself from the canopy beam, but the rope broke. She was found by Laia, who held her through the night until dawn. "You're still here," Laia whispered. That means something. But neither woman could say what. Caroline's turn came the next month, in October. Her body was too weak to endure another pregnancy. When her labor began, she slipped into delirium, screaming one moment, whispering for her mother the next. Dr. McCormick was summoned again. The sight of the girl nearly broke him. He worked frantically to save her life, ignoring Clement's orders to prioritize the child. But Caroline's body was too torn, her heart too tired. She survived, but only just. McCormick told Clement, "Another birth will kill her." Clement's reply was chilling in its simplicity. "Then we'll use others." The baby, a boy with pale skin and gray eyes, was sold within a fortnight. Caroline never asked to see him. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, murmuring the same phrase over and over. I didn't know the world could be this long. She would never fully recover. Her mind had split somewhere between pain and shame, and what remained was only fragments. Frida's final birth, Frida's pregnancy, was the worst of all. She had begged to be spared, had even threatened to end her life if forced again. Clement responded by locking her in her room for a week without food, until she agreed. The birth came in November, under a sky the color of iron. The screams were shorter this time, her strength almost gone. The child, a weak girl, survived. Frida did not speak for 2 days afterward. When she finally did, she whispered, "Don't let him take her." But Clement did. He sold the infant in New Orleans for $200. When he returned, he found Frida sitting motionless, staring at the empty cradle. She did not weep, only asked, "How many debts are left now, Father? Enough to buy your soul back?" He struck her, hard enough to split her lip. Then he left without answering. Frida never walked properly again. The damage from her labors left her permanently crippled. Yet she still moved around the house, quiet and determined, helping Caroline and Arlene when Joanna's strength faltered. Joanna's descent. Joanna's mind began to unravel that winter. Her days blurred into bottles of whiskey hidden behind flower jars. She spoke to shadows, to the ghosts of grandchildren she would never know. She prayed for forgiveness, but no longer knew which sin required it most, her husband's or her silence. Sometimes she stood in front of Clement's locked office door at night, whispering the Psalms backward like incantations. Once she tried to burn his ledger while he slept, but the creak of a floorboard gave her away. Clement caught her and dragged her back to bed, warning that madness runs quick in weak women. She did not fight him that night, but her eyes no longer looked at him. They looked through him, as if memorizing the place where she would one day bury him. The House of the Damned. By December 1862, Delaney Plantation had become a husk. The cotton fields lay neglected, the fences broken, and the main house reeked of sickness. The laughter of the girls was long gone. Even the birds avoided the eaves. Clement still spoke of profit and recovery, but the numbers no longer mattered. His slaves feared him, his wife loathed him, and his daughters were broken. Yet in his delusion, he believed himself successful. When the Confederacy began drafting men, he paid bribes to remain home. "My work is too important," he told the local officers. They believed he meant agriculture. Only God and the devil knew the truth. The gathering storm. In the quarters, Tobias met secretly with Leah and two other trusted men, Jonas and Abel. They had all been forced to partake in Clement's horror. Tobias's voice was low but steady. "We can't pray it away. We have to end it." They spoke of accidents, of poisoned whiskey, of fire, of ambush. Each plan risked all their lives, but none of them flinched. Joanna, when she learned of their intent weeks later, said only, "When the time comes, I will not stop you." The alliance was sealed in silence. Tobias would wait for Joanna's signal. She would wait for Clement's next cruelty, which she knew would not take long. The breaking point, Arlene's second child, was buried under the sycamore tree in January 1863. Frida, limping beside her mother, placed a handful of soil on the grave and whispered, "This land will eat him one day too." Clement, watching from the veranda, frowned at their delay. "Come inside," he said. "There's work to be done." That night the river rose high with rain, and a wind howled through the empty cotton rows. Upstairs, Frida sat awake, staring at the ceiling beam above her bed. Her rope was already hidden beneath the mattress, torn sheets twisted tight. She prayed softly. Not for rescue, but for an ending. Before dawn, Leah found her, and by the time the others reached the attic, Frida Delaney was already beyond pain. The horror that followed would tear the last veil from Joanna's soul and set the final act of vengeance into motion. The winter of 1863 began with silence. A silence too complete, too deliberate. It lay heavy across Delaney Plantation, pressing against the windows, filling the gaps between the floorboards, and resting like ash in the hearts of those who still lived there. Frida Delaney was dead, 17 years old, strangled by her own despair. The youngest daughter, the last spark of innocence in that house of cruelty, had chosen the only freedom left to her, and in doing so, she awakened the sleeping fury of everyone her father had crushed. The morning after Leah found Frida before sunrise, she had gone to bring her water and heard the faint creak from above, the sound of a board shifting under weight that shouldn't be there. When she saw the rope of torn sheets and the small, still figure hanging in the attic's dim light, she froze. For a moment, the world stopped moving. She screamed only once. Tobias came running, followed by Joanna, who nearly fell to her knees at the sight of her daughter suspended between heaven and hell. Her cry was not a scream, but a breaking, one long, guttural sound that emptied her lungs and hollowed her heart in a single breath. Clement arrived last, buttoning his shirt, irritated by the noise. When he saw Frida, he didn't touch her, didn't even step forward. His only words were, "Cut her down, quickly. We can't have the others see this." Leah obeyed with shaking hands while Joanna clung to the body, whispering apologies through tears. Clement stood over them, expression unreadable. His eyes flicked from his wife to the rope, then to the attic window. "She was weak," he said coldly, "and weakness is contagious." That was the moment something inside Joanna finally died, and something else, older and darker, began to live. The false funeral Frida was buried the same day under the sycamore near the slave quarters. Clement insisted it be quick and private. "There's no need for attention," he said. "We've had enough scandal." He told Sheriff Mullins the girl had been melancholic, a polite Southern euphemism for madness. The sheriff, accustomed to the hidden tragedies of plantations, nodded sympathetically and asked no more questions. Dr. McCormick signed the death certificate with trembling hands, noting faint bruises on Frida's arms that didn't match a hanging. He said nothing. At the graveside, Joanna didn't pray. She just stood with her hands folded, her face still as the stone sky above. When the last clump of earth hit the coffin, she whispered, "I will not fail you again." That vow would become her compass, her purpose and her weapon. Joanna's awakening in the days that followed. Joanna moved like a ghost through the halls, silent but watchful. She cleaned Clement's study when he was gone, memorizing where he kept his ledgers and his gun. She walked to the quarters under the pretense of distributing food, but spoke quietly with Tobias and Leah. "She's gone, because of me," Joanna told them one evening. "Because I let him rule this house like a god." Tobias shook his head. "He's not God, he bleeds. That means he can die." Those words lit a spark that spread quietly among the enslaved. For the first time, whispers in the quarters were not about escape. They were about justice. Laia, once afraid to look Clement in the eye, now met his gaze with defiance thinly veiled as obedience. Tobias began moving tools at night, setting aside what they would need. Joanna gathered keys, memorized the sound of each lock, and noted the nights Clement went to gamble in town. The plan was simple: wait for a night when the moon was hidden, when Clement returned drunk and alone. Then end him where no law could interfere. The living daughters Arlene and Caroline moved through their days like survivors of a wreck. Arlene spoke little but watched her mother with a faint, flickering hope. Caroline, pale and broken, barely left her room. Sometimes she laughed at nothing. Sometimes she whispered to someone who wasn't there. Joanna tended to them quietly, feeding them, brushing their hair, kissing their foreheads as if they were still children. But behind her gentleness now lived calculation. Every gesture had purpose. Every night she rehearsed in her mind the steps of what was coming. She no longer prayed for salvation. She prayed for precision. Clement's decline. Clement, meanwhile, was unraveling. He had grown paranoid, convinced that everyone was plotting against him. He accused Tobias of theft, struck Laia across the face for insubordination, and locked Joanna's door at night. He drank heavily now, his gambling worse than ever. Each trip to New Orleans brought smaller profits, fewer buyers. The war had begun to collapse the markets, and his products were no longer easy to sell. His once meticulous ledger grew sloppy, ink stains, smudged numbers, trembling script. Yet even as his empire rotted, Clement still saw himself as master of all. "They depend on me," he muttered often, pacing his study. "They can't live without me." What he didn't see was how wrong he was. The Whispering Alliance in February 1863, Joanna met Tobias in the dark behind the smokehouse. Rain fell lightly, soaking the ground, but neither moved. "He must not die quick," Joanna said, her voice low and steady. "He must know what he did before he leaves this world." Tobias nodded. "There's more who will help. Abel, Jonas, Ruth, they've lost too much to fear him anymore. And the others? They'll stay quiet. But they'll not warn him either." Joanna gripped Tobias's hand, a forbidden gesture between a white woman and a black man. But in that moment, they were simply two broken souls bound by the same grief. "When I signal," she whispered, "you'll know." The signal would come sooner than either expected. The final provocation: by March, Arlene was pregnant again. Joanna had tried to hide it from Clement, but his ledger told him what his eyes did not. When he found out, he laughed, not with joy, but with triumph. "You see, Joanna," he said, lifting his glass of whiskey. "Even after death, life obeys me." The line continues. Joanna slapped the glass from his hand. "She will not suffer like the others," she hissed. Clement stared at her, the shock fading into cold fury. "Careful, wife," he said. "You forget your place?" "No," she replied softly. "I've finally remembered it." That night she went to Tobias and said 3 words. "It's time now." The night of decision. The chosen night came in July. Thunder rolled across the river. Rain fell in thick, heavy sheets. Clement had gone to a nearby tavern to gamble, as usual, leaving after supper with his flask and his revolver. Joanna waited by the window, counting the hours. Tobias, Abel, and Jonas slipped into position along the trail that wound through the woods toward the plantation. Laia stayed in the kitchen, ready to lock the doors after it was done. Joanna carried the lantern herself and followed the back path to the edge of the trees. Her dress was soaked by the time she reached them, but her resolve was dry and hard. "Remember," she told Tobias, "make it look like robbery. And don't hesitate." He looked at her with quiet respect. "You sure you don't want to be the one?" She met his eyes. "I already am." They waited. The ambush. It was near midnight when Clement appeared, weaving slightly on horseback, singing off-key into the storm. His coat flapped open, his hat askew. The rain turned his face slick and pale, like a man already halfway to the grave. When the flash of lightning illuminated the trail, he saw movement, too late. Tobias stepped from the shadows, striking the horse's bridle, sending the animal rearing. Clement fell hard into the mud, cursing. Before he could draw his gun, Abel swung the shovel. The sound was sharp and wet. Clement gasped, struggling, but Joanna was already there. She knelt beside him, mud streaking her face, eyes blazing. He looked up at her, recognition flickering into horror. "Joanna, help me." Her voice was calm, almost tender. "I am helping you. I'm sending you to meet the God you claim to serve." Tobias's blade flashed once more. When the light of the next strike faded, Clement Delaney was no longer a man, just a body in the mud, washed clean by rain and justice. The staging, they worked quickly. Joanna scattered his papers across the trail and slit the horse's flank to mimic an attack. Tobias took the pistol and threw it into the river. They stripped Clement's pockets of money and tore his coat to shreds. By dawn, the scene told a perfect lie. A robbery, violent but plausible. In the chaos of a nation at war, one more dead landowner would draw no questions. Joanna walked back to the plantation with mud on her dress and thunder still echoing in her ears. When the sun rose, she sat on the veranda with a cup of cold coffee and waited for the news. The aftermath Sheriff Mullins arrived at noon. The body had been found by a passing farmer. "Terrible business," he said gravely. "Bandits everywhere these days," Joanna nodded, eyes dry. "My husband made enemies. I warned him not to travel alone." The sheriff tipped his hat. "God rest him." "Yes," Joanna said softly. "God rest him indeed." That night she buried the ledger behind the sycamore tree, beside Frida's grave. "Now," she whispered, "none of your words will ever hurt another soul." The wind picked up, and for a moment she could have sworn she heard her daughter's voice in the rustling leaves. "Thank you." Epilogue of the living Clement Delaney's death was recorded as robbery by unknown assailants. The plantation fell silent, not in fear this time, but in relief. Joanna freed the remaining slaves and began selling off the land piece by piece. Arlene gave birth a month later. A fragile baby girl she named Hope. Joanna wept when she held her, seeing in that tiny face the faintest proof that goodness could still grow in poisoned soil. Caroline never fully recovered, her mind lost between memory and madness. She lived quietly, cared for by her mother until the end of her days. Tobias and Leah disappeared north after their freedom was secured. Some said they joined the Union lines. Others believed they simply wanted peace. But those who passed by the Delaney land years later swore that when the wind blew through the old sycamore, it carried two voices, one whispering sorrow, and the other forgiveness. The summer of 1863 bled slowly into autumn. The air, once thick with the smell of sweat and sorrow, grew quiet over Delaney Plantation. The fields lay untended, wild vines creeping over the old cotton rows, swallowing the fences Clement had built with such pride. Inside the weathered house, where every wall had once echoed with screams, only the faint sound of a child's breathing remained. Clement Delaney was gone, buried in a shallow grave that bore no name. His death recorded as the act of nameless thieves. But the house he left behind, the soil, the family, and the souls he'd broken, all of it still carried the mark of his hand. And it was Joanna who now carried the burden of cleansing that mark, even if redemption came too late. A house without a master. The day after Clement's funeral, the plantation stood eerily still. No whip cracked. No orders echoed through the fields. The slaves, now free, moved quietly, uncertain whether freedom was real or another cruel trick. Joanna gathered them in the yard beneath the sycamore tree, the same tree where Frida and the stolen children were buried. Her dress was black, her face pale, but her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had walked through hell and returned carrying its fire. "You owe no man on this land anything anymore," she said, looking from face to face. "If you wish to go, go. If you wish to stay, stay as free souls, not property." The words broke something invisible. For the first time in years, Tobias lifted his head without fear. Leah's lips trembled, tears rolling freely. Others bowed, not in obedience, but in gratitude. One by one, they began to leave the fields that had once held their ancestors' blood, walking down the dirt road toward an uncertain but rightful freedom. Joanna watched them go, her heart heavy with both relief and loneliness. She had freed them from the man who enslaved them, but not from the memories he had left behind, the remnants of horror. Arlene's baby, small, frail but miraculously alive, became the fragile symbol of what was left of the Delaney family. Joanna named her Hope, believing that the name itself might heal what faith could not. Arlene cared for her daughter with desperate tenderness, her blue eyes hollow but filled with something that looked faintly like purpose. Caroline, however, never came back from the darkness. Some days she wandered the halls whispering to shadows, calling out to Frida as if she were still alive. Other days she sat by the window for hours, motionless, staring out at the empty fields. Joanna would find her that way at dawn, the pale light catching her vacant eyes. "Do you hear them, Mother?" Caroline would ask. "Hear who, my dear?" Joanna would reply softly. "The children," Caroline whispered. "The ones he sold. They're crying for their names." Joanna would take her hand and squeeze it gently, though inside she too sometimes thought she heard faint cries echoing through the walls. Tobias's departure, a week after the funeral, Tobias came to Joanna at dusk. The air was thick with mosquitoes, the river swollen from summer rain. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, his expression solemn but free for the first time. "I'm heading north," he said. "Word is the Union needs strong men." "Maybe that's where I'll find peace," Joanna nodded. "You've already earned your peace 100 times over." He looked down at the dirt under his boots. "Peace don't come easy for men who've seen what I've seen. But I thank you, Miss Joanna, for what you did." She smiled faintly. "Don't thank me, Tobias. Thank Frida. It was her death that woke me." Tobias nodded, eyes glistening. "Then I'll carry her memory with me, north or nowhere." Before he left, he placed something in her hand. Clement's old ledger, the one she thought she had buried. "I found it," he said. "You should burn it. But I reckon you'll want to read it first." When he walked away, disappearing into the trees, Joanna opened the book. The pages were smeared with mud and old blood. The handwriting grew frantic toward the end, words crossing over each other. Profit, children, debt, birth, value. She closed it and placed it under her arm. She would not burn it. Not yet. Fire and forgiveness. That night, Joanna climbed to the attic, the same place Frida had ended her life. She brought with her the ledger, a candle, and a bottle of whiskey she had hidden since the night of Clement's death. She lit the candle and sat on the floorboards, her back against the wall, her eyes on the beam that still bore the faint scar of the rope. "You can rest now," she whispered. "He's gone. The chain's broken." Then she opened the ledger once more and began to read. Page by page, line by line, she let herself confront every horror her husband had written. The profits from infant sales, the forged names of mothers, the neat columns where human life had been reduced to currency. By the time she reached the last entry, tears had washed streaks through the dust on her cheeks. She struck the match and set the ledger alight. The flame caught quickly, curling the pages, devouring the ink that had bound so many souls to paper. Joanna watched until nothing remained but ash. Then she whispered, "Forgive me," to no one in particular, perhaps to her daughters, perhaps to God, perhaps to the ghosts that lingered in the rafters. When the candle burned low, she opened the attic window. The smoke rose into the night air, carrying the last of Clement's sins into the dark sky. Lia's choice Lia stayed a while longer, caring for Arlene and the baby. She worked quietly, often humming old Creole lullabies to calm the child. But the plantation held too many ghosts, and freedom had a way of calling louder with each passing day. One morning, she came to Joanna's room with a small bundle of clothes and bread wrapped in cloth. "I'm heading to New Orleans," she said softly. "There's work for a seamstress there." "And maybe peace," Joanna embraced her. "You saved my life, Lia, and theirs. Don't ever think I'll forget that." Lia smiled sadly. "We all saved each other in our own ways." She left that afternoon, walking down the same road Tobias had taken, her figure shrinking against the golden horizon until she was gone. Joanna stood on the porch long after, holding the baby who would never know the woman who once sang her to sleep. The weight of memory years passed. The war ended. Freedom became law, though not peace. The plantation was sold in pieces. First the fields, then the barns, until only the big house and a few acres remained. Joanna lived there quietly with Arlene, Caroline, and little Hope. Caroline's mind continued to fade, her memories dissolving like fog. She would often walk to the sycamore and sit for hours, whispering names that no one else remembered. Arlene, though scarred in body and spirit, grew stronger. She taught Hope to read, to sew, to pray. Sometimes when the sun was low, Joanna would find her humming, a sound so faint and beautiful it almost sounded like forgiveness. Joanna herself aged quickly. Her hair turned white, her hands frail, but her eyes never lost their sharpness. She spent her final years writing letters, confessions of what had happened at Delaney Plantation. She sent them to churches, newspapers, anyone who would listen. Most never replied. But she kept writing. "I do not seek pity," she wrote. "I seek remembrance, because evil forgotten is evil reborn." The final reckoning on. The night before her death, Joanna dreamt of the sycamore. In her dream, the tree had grown enormous, its roots reaching deep into the earth, its branches stretching to the stars. Beneath it stood Frida, smiling, not the broken girl of the past, but radiant, whole. "You did what you could," Frida said. "You made it end." Joanna reached out, but Frida only shook her head gently. "You don't need to come to me, Mama. I'll come to you." The next morning, Arlene found Joanna sitting in her chair by the window, her eyes open, her face peaceful. The sun streamed across her features, illuminating the faint smile that lingered there. She had died looking toward the river, the same river that had once carried away the cries of her stolen grandchildren. Now it carried only peace, legacy. The Delaney Plantation house stood abandoned for years, slowly sinking into the earth. Travelers who passed by claimed that on still nights, they could hear faint voices near the old sycamore, soft weeping mixed with lullabies. Locals said it was the ghosts of the children Clement had sold, finally finding their way home. Others said it was the wind through the empty chimneys, but some swore that if you stood beneath that tree at dusk, you could hear Joanna's voice, steady and clear, whispering to the living, "Remember. What's buried in silence grows again. Speak it. Always speak it." The year was 1863, and war thundered across the South like an angry god. But on one small dirt road cutting through the swampy outskirts of St. James Parish, another storm gathered, one not of politics or armies, but of vengeance. That road would become known in whispered stories as Storm Road, the place where justice finally came for Clement Delaney. And on that rain-lashed night, the wind itself seemed to rise to bear witness. The night before, the day before the ambush, the air over Delaney Plantation had been strangely calm, like the world was holding its breath. Clouds stacked low above the cane fields, heavy and silent. Joanna spent the afternoon preparing supper as she always did. Routine was safety, and she'd learned that the best disguise for revolution was domestic quiet. Arlene and Caroline sat together by the window, sewing in silence. Hope slept upstairs, her tiny breaths the only rhythm left in that broken house. As the sun bled out behind the trees, Joanna went to her husband's study. She stood before his empty chair, her hands shaking only once before she steadied them on the desk. Clement's ledger lay open, the ink still wet from his last entry. He'd written, "Arlene, late term, birth expected soon. Sale to be arranged discreetly." She stared at those words until they blurred into lines of black. Then she closed the book, placed the brass key beside it, and whispered, "Tomorrow, that hand will never write again." That evening, when the house went quiet, she met Tobias and Leah behind the barn. They spoke few words. There was no need for many. "Tomorrow night," Joanna said, her voice soft but certain. "He'll go to the tavern. He always does when the rain threatens. That's when we end it." Tobias nodded once. Leah's eyes glistened, not with fear but with grim understanding. "The Lord forgive us," she whispered. "He already has," Joanna replied. "It's man who hasn't." The gathering storm by dusk the next day. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat, warm, and heavy, splattering against the windows like thrown stones. The sky was the color of bruised iron. Clement dressed for the tavern, humming tunelessly as he fastened his coat. Joanna helped him with his collar, her face blank, her movements careful. When he reached for his hat, she paused long enough to whisper, "Stay close to the road tonight." He chuckled, misunderstanding. "Afraid I'll lose my way?" "Afraid you'll find what you've been running from," she said softly. He frowned but said nothing. Moments later, the door shut behind him, and the wheels of his horse cart splashed into the mud, carrying him toward his final mile. In the darkened fields, Tobias waited with two others, Abel and Jonas, hidden among the trees. Their clothes were soaked, the air thick with the smell of rain and pine. Joanna stood further down the road, a lantern half covered with her shawl, its faint glow their signal. The storm was building fast. lightning flashing across the river, thunder rolling low and hungry. The road it was near midnight when the first sound reached them, the rhythmic clop of hooves, the jingle of harness, a man's drunken singing cutting through the rain. Clement was returning, his voice slurred, his laughter loud. Joanna watched the small light of his lantern bob closer. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might tear itself apart. Every step, every breath carried the weight of the years she had endured in silence. When the cart reached the bend, she lifted her shawl, revealing the lantern's full flame. That was the signal. Tobias stepped out first, his figure framed by lightning. The horse reared, panicked by the sudden shape in the road. Clement cursed, struggling with the reins. But before he could reach for his pistol, Jonas swung a club against his shoulder, sending him sprawling into the mud. Abel grabbed the horse's bridle, pulling it aside. The cart overturned with a crash, spilling bottles, papers, and Clement's briefcase into the muck. Joanna walked forward, her black dress clinging to her skin, her eyes shining with something colder than the rain. "Who's there?" Clement shouted, spitting water, reaching for the weapon at his belt. Tobias kicked it away, sending it into the ditch. Clement looked up, blinking through the storm, and froze when he saw her. "Joanna?" he stammered. "Good Lord, what are you—" "Don't," she said sharply. "You don't speak that name. You lost the right." He tried to rise, but Tobias held him down. "You don't have to do this," Clement gasped. "Think of the girls, think of—" Joanna knelt beside him, her hair plastered to her face, her voice calm and low. "I am thinking of them," she said. "Every breath they've taken since you damned them. Every night they've wept. Every child you sold for coin." Clement's eyes darted toward Tobias, pleading. "You do this for her? For a white woman?" Tobias didn't answer. He only looked at Joanna, waiting for her nod. She gave it. The end of the monster lightning cracked, white and blinding. In that brief light, Joanna saw her husband's face one last time. Not as a man, but as the thing he had become, eyes wild, teeth bared, still trying to twist the world into submission. Tobias struck once, clean and final. The sound was swallowed by thunder. Clement Delaney fell back into the mud, the rain already washing his blood into the earth he had poisoned. For a long moment, no one spoke. The storm raged overhead, trees bending like witnesses, bowing their heads. Joanna's hands shook, not from fear, but from the release of years of torment. "It's done," she whispered. Tobias nodded, voice low. "What now?" "Now," she said, "we bury the devil and free the rest of us." The staging, they worked quickly, the rain helping hide their tracks. Abel and Jonas dragged Clement's body to the side of the road. They slit the horse's flank to mimic a robbery and scattered his belongings. Tobias wiped the prints from the cart, and Joanna took his ledger, the black book that had begun it all. When it was over, she stood over her husband's corpse one last time. "May the worms show you more mercy than you ever gave," she said quietly. Then she walked back toward the plantation, lightning illuminating her silhouette like a shadow carved from vengeance itself. Behind her, Tobias whispered a short prayer, not for Clement, but for the souls he'd destroyed. The dawn by morning, the rain had stopped. The sky blushed faintly pink, as if embarrassed by the violence it had concealed. A passing farmer found the body just after sunrise and rode to town. Sheriff Mullins arrived hours later. He took one look at the scene, the slashed horse, the overturned cart, the empty pockets, and sighed. "Bandits," he muttered. "Happening everywhere these days." He closed the case before it began. Back at the plantation, Joanna greeted him with perfect composure. "Yes," she said. "He left last night and never returned. I feared as much." The sheriff tipped his hat, offered condolences, and rode away. Joanna watched him disappear down the road, her face unreadable. Inside, the weight she'd carried for years began to lift. Not completely, but enough to let her breathe again. The cleansing that night. Joanna walked to the sycamore with a shovel and Clement's ledger under her arm. She dug into the damp soil beside Frida's grave until her arms trembled. Then she buried the book, the proof, the guilt, the record of every child and every crime. As she covered the hole, she whispered, "No law will ever judge you. So I will, and I declare your sentence served." The wind stirred, rustling the leaves. For a moment, Joanna thought she heard her daughter's voices carried in the breeze, soft, like lullabies from another time. She turned back toward the house, the lantern flickering in her hand. The legend of Storm Road years later. Travelers passing through the parish told stories of the Delaney ghost. They said that on stormy nights, when thunder rolled and the road turned to mud, you could see a lantern burning in the distance, a woman in black walking beside it. Some said it was Joanna Delaney, searching for her daughter's lost souls. Others said it was justice itself, still guarding the road where evil met its end. But those who lived near the ruins of the plantation knew better. They would whisper, "That's not a ghost, that's a warning," because every so often, the earth along that road shifts slightly after the rain, like something buried deep below still tries to rise. And when the wind howls through the cypress trees, it almost sounds like a woman's voice, calm, steady, and unyielding. Remember, silence makes monsters, and justice walks in storms. The year after Clement Delaney's death was the quietest the Mississippi Delta had ever known. The war still raged far beyond the parish, but for those who lived near the decaying husk of Delaney Plantation, it was as if the world itself had gone still, waiting to see what would rise from the ruins. The house, once filled with voices of command and weeping, had fallen into an unnatural peace. The master was gone. The fields were empty. Only 3 souls remained: Joanna, her broken daughter Caroline, and Arlene with her infant child. Together they lived in the hollow left behind when terror had finally spent itself. Yet even peace can carry echoes. And the walls of that house remembered everything. The days after, when Sheriff Mullins declared Clement's death a robbery, no one questioned it. The town spoke of it for a week, how the gambler Delaney had met his fate on a lonely road, and then turned its gossip elsewhere. For Joanna, every hour that followed was a strange mixture of freedom and fear. She no longer heard footsteps on the stairs or the sharp crack of her husband's voice. Yet each night she found herself listening still, as if expecting him to return and undo everything. She spent the mornings cleaning, scrubbing floors that had known too much blood, throwing out clothes that still carried his scent, burning papers in the yard until ash drifted like gray snow. Caroline wandered the house barefoot, lost in her own fading mind. She spoke to shadows, sometimes laughing softly, sometimes crying for Frida. Joanna never corrected her. Arlene tried to hold on to life. Her daughter, Hope, was small but strong, and the child's laughter was the only sound in that house that did not seem haunted. At night, Arlene would hold her close and whisper, "You will never know the world he built. You will only know what we survived." A visit from the past weeks later, Dr. McCormick arrived unannounced. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, shame etched deep in the lines of his face. "Mrs. Delaney," he said softly, "I heard of your loss." Joanna looked at him for a long moment. "You mean his loss, doctor?" "I've lost enough," he bowed his head. "I should have done more," he confessed. "I saw the signs. I saw the girls. And I turned my eyes away." Joanna's voice was calm, but her eyes glinted with a quiet, terrible truth. "We all turned our eyes away, doctor. That's why God sends storms, to make us look." He said nothing after that. He simply left a small box on the porch before departing. Inside, Joanna found a silver crucifix and a letter. "For the graves you were never allowed to mark." That night, she took the crucifix to the sycamore and hung it from one of its low branches. The moonlight caught the metal, and for a moment it looked like a star had descended to rest among the leaves. Caroline's fading as months passed. Caroline's mind drifted further into silence. She forgot names, days, even her own reflection. Sometimes she thought the baby was hers. Sometimes she thought Frida was still alive. One cold morning in January, Joanna found her daughter sitting at Frida's grave, barefoot in the frost, humming a lullaby. The hem of her dress was soaked in dew. "She comes to me in dreams," Caroline said quietly. "She says she's not cold anymore." Joanna wrapped her shawl around her daughter's shoulders, her own tears frozen before they could fall. "Then let her keep you warm," she whispered. Caroline died in her sleep 2 winters later, her body frail, her face serene. Joanna buried her beside Frida, under the same tree, marking the graves with wooden crosses carved by Tobias before he left. The child of hope. As hope grew, the house began to breathe again. She was light in a place that had known only shadow. She had Arlene's hair and her mother's eyes that carried both sorrow and strength. Joanna taught her to read from the Bible and to write her name in the dust on the old dining table. Every letter you learn, Joanna told her, is another chain broken. When Hope asked one day, "Grandmother, why do you never go near the fields?" Joanna smiled sadly. "Because the earth remembers what we buried in it. And some things should never bloom again." Hope would later say that her grandmother spoke to the wind more than to people. But the child didn't fear it. She believed the wind was full of stories only Joanna could hear. Lia's return in 1866, long after freedom had been declared and the South lay broken, a figure appeared at the gate. It was Lia, older, thinner, but alive. She had come from New Orleans carrying a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Inside were papers, birth certificates, letters, and one tattered church record. "I found them," she said. "The babies, or at least their names. Some survived, Joanna. Some lived." Joanna took the bundle with trembling hands. Her eyes filled as she whispered. Then their souls were stronger than their fate. Lia stayed only one night. Before she left, she stood beneath the sycamore, closed her eyes and said softly, "They can rest now." Joanna's final winter. Joanna grew weaker with age. Her hair white as the ash she had once used to scrub the floors. But her mind remained sharp to the end. She began to write her own account of what had happened, a confession not to the church, but to history. In ink that faded with time, she wrote, "The devil does not arrive with horns or fire. He comes as a husband, a provider, a man praised by his neighbors, and when good women stay silent, the devil builds empires in their homes." She finished the manuscript one autumn night and placed it inside a wooden box with a small key. She gave it to Hope. "When I'm gone," Joanna said, "and people tell you the past is better forgotten, open this box. Read every word. Remember the truth." She died that winter, in her chair by the fire, her eyes half open, her hand resting on the Bible she no longer needed to pray from. The final fall of Delaney House. After Joanna's death, Arlene and Hope left the plantation. They sold what little remained and moved to Baton Rouge, where Hope would grow into a teacher, a woman who told stories of the forgotten, not in sermons but in lessons. The Delaney house stood empty for decades, its shutters falling, its roof caving inward. Nature reclaimed what men had defiled. Locals said that during storms, you could still see light glowing from the upstairs window, and hear faint cries beneath the wind. Some claimed it was Clement's spirit begging for forgiveness. Others said it was Joanna keeping watch, making sure evil stayed buried. By the turn of the century, only the sycamore remained massive and unyielding, its roots wrapped deep around the graves of those who had suffered and those who had sinned. Legacy in 1901. Hope, now an old woman herself, returned for the last time. The land had grown wild, the path nearly vanished. She found the sycamore still standing and placed her hand against its bark. "I've told your story, grandmother," she whispered. They listened this time. As she turned to leave, a soft breeze stirred the branches, and a single silver leaf drifted down, landing in her palm. She smiled through her tears. "I know," she said quietly. "You can rest now." Epilogue. The echoes today. Nothing remains of Delaney Plantation, but the whisper of wind through reeds and the faint outline of a foundation swallowed by moss. But travelers still say that when lightning flashes over the river, they sometimes see 3 figures under the sycamore. One tall woman with white hair, one young girl holding a baby, and one smaller figure standing just beyond the light, smiling faintly. And if you listen close enough, between the thunder and the rustle of leaves, you can hear a single line carried on the delta wind, soft, stern, eternal. Evil dies when silence breaks. The End Legacy of Fear, the Delaney Plantation Chronicles, a story of horror, survival, and the fragile redemption that grows from remembrance.